Testing, testing. All right. Okay, that's now working. It's swapped over the microphone inputs for some godforsaken reason. Oh, how I hate computers. Okay, so, hello. Apologies for the minor delay. As you can possibly tell, had some minor technical setbacks. But that's alright because very shortly we are going to start painting, or finish painting, this spaceship. And just whilst I get everything set up, a couple of words about what today's stream is and isn't going to be. This isn't intended to be like a masterclass. I've never pretended to be anything more than an adequate painter, buoyed by an airbrush and a lot of masking tape. But this is more to show off the model itself and to show off how easy they are to paint, and just to give people sort of more of an idea of what they look like and sort of how they go together. Yeah, and I just wanted to sort of have an opportunity to talk a bit more about Solar Dominion, how things are going, what the plan is. And I've just noticed my little chat window is not working. Oh, how I hate computers with a fiery, fiery passion. And now just to post on the Twitters. And if I can, I guess I'll have to go to the stupid YouTube one. Alright. That's live and out. There. Right. So, with all of that bullshit out of the way, can finally actually start painting this model. Alright, so if you watched last week's stream, we took this model from from being bare resin to, well, looking like this, and it sat basically here for the last week. Resisted the urge to mess about with it some more off camera because that's what we're going to do today. And so today we're just going to neaten up some of the work we did last week, apply some targeted washes to give it a bit more contrast, paint some of the details, and call it a day and see what you can do in a very limited amount of time to get your ships ready for the tabletop. And a lot of the techniques here, like last week's of masking, are perfectly applicable to models from a variety of manufacturers for a variety of games. It's not like anything I'm talking about here is a special technique that will only work on my miniatures. So just the first thing I'm going to do here is, the first thing is probably try and figure out if there's a way I can zoom this camera. If I can just figure out something. Nah. There's going to be no stream next week, and I will pick up again the week after, where we will be looking at the other sort of primary faction for Solar Dominion and their ships. So all I'm doing here is I am just going through and just neatening up this line that we spray painted on. So if I just bring it up to the camera briefly, you can see, especially sort of around here, the masking tape wasn't down quite properly. If I'd taken more care and attention when applying it, probably could have avoided some of that. But it's quite easy just to go in after the fact and using the lines that were more well defined, just go in and apply some more paint, trying very carefully to maintain a nice straight line. And then similarly, we had a couple of little areas of paint lift where the primer didn't quite adhere, and so we're just going to put some, just dab the paint over. And then over here, the masking tape didn't quite stick down properly, and so we had some paint run as opposed to paint lift. But again, because it's just in this nice channel, which is probably the same reason why the paint ran, we can just carefully run the brush along there and fix it. And then similarly here on the neck, you can just about see where the tape had lifted a little bit, and thus you got just the tiniest amount of white paint. And whilst right now the paint is a slightly different colour, when it dries it'll dry the same. And like I said, our only real goal here is to just neaten up the line we've already drawn last week with the airbrush. I do kind of have a plan for, at some point in the future, doing a video where I show you how to paint these ships entirely using spray cans, because I did get a couple of comments after last week's video that not everyone has airbrushes, not everyone wants to invest in buying an airbrush, and that's perfectly fair. They are not cheap. I love mine to bits. But they're also not for everyone. They certainly require more cleanup than just brush painting, more attention. They're not really something that you can just decide, well, and especially if like you're a student or you live in a small house or you've got kids or pets with respiratory issues or whatever, they do require a bit more planning. Whereas a lot of people have access to spray paint and spray cans, and so it should be entirely possible to paint a fleet of ships in an afternoon to a reasonable standard with just spray cans. So our next step, if you look at the picture in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, one of the details that we've got on there that we don't have on this model yet are blue stripes running down the sides of the weapons. So we're now just going to paint those on. So, very carefully, trying to carefully draw a straight line, trying to keep it about the same thickness as that little sensor turret at the top. It's not hard, you just need to be patient, not rush it. And then we will repeat that with the second one. And one thing just to pay attention to is to make sure that you actually paint the little lip as it goes over the front, but you can see that that does quite quickly just add a little bit more visual detail and visual interest to the model. Then I'm just going to quickly do the one under the wing. using that one as the stepping off point for painting the other side. And here what we're interested in is making sure that we paint the backs just to and then we can just quickly move on to painting the other side of the ship. I have also had at least one question of have I considered trying to get pre-painted miniatures available, and the answer to which is yeah, if I was rich. Unfortunately, the cost alone of getting plastic miniatures made is insane. Pre-painted plastic miniatures would be well beyond any budget that I could imagine this game commanding in even the short-term future. So I mean, if there's any sort of wealthy philanthropist, rich person who wants to give me £500,000 to go and make a game about spaceships with plastic miniatures and be able to offer them pre-painted, be my guest. I will be more than happy to take your money and make a game. In the absence of that, I'm really hoping to get a Kickstarter out by the end of the year, so that people can get their hands on it, and in the coming weeks there will be the print and play version I described last week. And I have briefly misplaced the next paint that I need, which was clever. One moment. Alright, I am back. And I just remembered that there is one more piece of blue that we need to paint before we move on to painting the gunmetal parts. And that is, and one of my favourite little pieces of detail on the model, if the camera will autofocus, there's the little UN sigil embossed on every UNM spaceship. And it's just one of my favourite little pieces of detail, and it's so easy to paint. Because it's a lovely little piece of raised detail. All you really have to do is just kind of run your brush over it with a not too heavily loaded paintbrush. And we'll pick that out with a targeted wash a little bit later. So the base that this miniature is on at the moment has got a 1.5mm brass rod. The actual sort of final production versions will be sat on 3mm acrylic rods and will have a hole cast into them. Which should hopefully help alleviate the issue that like this one's got, where I drilled the hole a little bit too big. So the next thing we've got to do is there's a bunch of sort of nice little metallic mechanical details, and so we're just going to take a little bit of Vallejo Game Color Gunmetal 72054. And just to sort of clarify, all this blue is still UK Azure Blue, which is from the Vallejo Model Air range 721-108. And whilst yes it is an airbrush paint, it's a nice consistency for brush painting as well. With this Game Color paint though, I'm just going to add a little bit of water. So the first thing I'm going to paint is just the engines. So there are two little engine pods at the back, and then there's two at the front, and we will paint them all gunmetal to start. This is just a case of taking your time. And carefully applying paint. Now here I'm probably not going to, because I'm on my personal miniatures, I am not the biggest fan of the effect. So I'm not going to add like any sort of engine flare or engine glow. But it's super easy to do, and so I might do it, depends how much time we have left, or I might save that for a future video where I show a bunch of techniques. So here I've just gotten a little bit of gunmetal on where it shouldn't be, so I'm just going to take a little bit of the Vallejo Model Air White Grey, and I'm just going to neaten that up. And then, so as we've done the ones on the back, there are two small engine pods on the front. And it's much the same. Just carefully applying paint. One thing I will say is, whilst this is sort of the sort of main official colour scheme, there will be at least one alternate colour scheme in the book, but also there's nothing stopping you from picking your own. I'm almost tempted to award some kind of prize for the first person to show me a pic, or once these are released, to show me a picture of a bright pink fleet, or even just a single bright pink ship. Maybe the prize will be another ship. So now all I'm doing is, with some thinned down gunmetal, if you can see the front of the missile launcher, I'm just painting the open face with some thinned down gunmetal. Later on we'll go in just with some orange or red and just pick out the actual launch tubes, which you can, unfortunately you at home possibly can't make out. If I can actually point them at the camera and get the camera to focus. You did it for a minute, camera. You can just see that detail there. I do plan on making that a little bit more pronounced. A little while ago on Twitter there was some discussion between a bunch of people about how the only real acceptable option for selling miniatures was to show actual castings, preferably painted castings. And I guess that's part of the reason why I'm doing this. Because yeah, I could just show you the renders that I've shown you for ages. But showing an actual miniature, and whilst this isn't a cast one, this is a 3D printed one. I guess the idea behind casting is that the cast one should be identical to this. Although I will say, part of the problem with having them as prints and not having had, and not sending them off to get cast is almost every time I do, there's yet another sort of little detail I want to change or improve. And these days, most of them aren't even cosmetic. It's all this would make it easier to assemble, or this would make it sort of slightly easier to paint, or this would make it look in real life more like how the renders look. And yeah, one of like the giant things about that is because true physically based 3D rendering is so computationally expensive, we almost everything about how computers display 3D models is a trick of the light. Alright, before I continue my rant about 3D modeling and 3D rendering, the next thing we're going to do is just all across the top, we've got a bunch of little details of these escape pods here, these little hatches here, and on the underside here and here. And we're just going to fill those in with gunmetal, which just gives the model just a teensy bit more visual detail. Because whilst this faction has like is designed with like a sparse aesthetic in mind, it's those deviations from that that really make the model stand out. And whilst I'm hoping and I'm sure that many of you out there will paint these ships in stunning, super reserved, super restrained colour palettes and make them look amazing, there's got to be something for the rest of us. And yeah, you can see how just picking those details out just gives the eye something to grab onto. But yes, back to the rant about computer rendering. There is a technique called ambient occlusion, which I think that paint too much. which fakes the kind of shadows you get on things where two objects come very close together, and thus not a lot of light can get in between them and bounce around there, which is what makes most things look, and especially like stuff in daylight, look natural. Um, and the lack of ambient occlusion is part of the reason why so many early 3D renderings and computer games look so flat. And there are two ways to fix this if you're making a computer game or you're doing like a 3D rendering. One is to properly simulate light, but that's expensive and time consuming. We're starting to see it become more accessible. I mean, if you're familiar with computer graphics cards, you will be somewhat familiar with the term ray tracing. That's the technique, and part of the reason why games developers are so interested in it is because it allows them to use, well, it makes their games look more realistic. Light bounces around as it does in real life. Or there's a technique generally known as screen space ambient occlusion, which fakes it. But the problem is that when you fake it, it's sort of purposefully making very shallow details appear deeper, and so it's very easy as a digital sculptor to forget that what you're looking at is shallower than it looks, and the fact that obviously you're looking effectively at a picture of your model, not the model itself, because unfortunately, like a lot of the tools that people use don't really support VR yet. Granted, I have no idea what ZBrush VR support looks like, but at least from a couple of conversations I've had with sort of 3D Max users, it's still not. It is still sort of in the land of dirty, hacky plugins. And so much in the same way that there's sort of massive differences in how close a camera is to a model and what sort of zoom level you're using, and do you have a macro lens on, can have a massive effect on how a picture of like a real model looks. Imagine if now the only way that you were allowed to sculpt or paint or sort of do anything like that was looking through your phone's selfie lens. That's how some miniatures are sculpted today. And if you've got like a regular sort of feedback loop where the miniature is getting printed and you can sort of look at it for errors and issues and places where where it needs more detail, more depth, then I can see no problems with this technique. In fact, this is how I work until I can justify spending money on a VR headset and then fighting to get it working with Blender. But when you're actually selling it to the public and you're asking the public to trust that your miniature is something that they should buy, then yeah, the only real option is to actually show them what they'll get. And even if that's, like I said, a 3D print that you've cleaned up nicely to ideally the same level that you'd clean up a master, not like this one here, and then paint, well, so where I deviate from what people were saying on Twitter is I would love to see one just primed as well as painted, just because in my experience, especially with like a studio level paint job, there are a lot of sins that can be hidden with a studio level paint job, where me, Joe Average, is just going to get entirely lost on the model. So now we've just got two now one more little panel on the front. Stick it back on its base. And there we've got, just hold it up to the camera, just a little bit more visual detail to the model now. So the next step is to grab the orange paint and just to start picking out a couple of details, like, well, no, the next step is going to be, we're going to apply some washes. And that will involve carefully applying washes only in the recesses. Now normally I am a big proponent of just sort of all over washes, because I think that it's an easy, fast way of applying a lot of detail to a model. But I understand that not everyone thinks that way. And here, just with white is like my one major exception, especially since I've started doing white more with an airbrush, as opposed to my previous technique of applying one sort of slapdash coat of white, followed by dry brushing, well then wash, then dry brush over the top. And so here, I'm using two washes available from Games Workshop. Drakenov Nightshade, which is like the dark blue, and Nuln Oil, which is their black. And broadly speaking, I'm going to apply Nuln Oil first to all of like the metallic areas, and this is going to just give us a little bit of shading. It's going to tone down the metallic sheen a bit. And so I'm just going to get some on a brush and just carefully apply it to all of the metallic areas. So starting with these front engines, the idea is it should, through surface tension, settle around all of those edges and just sort of provide us with our own little bit of ambient occlusion. I can just drop some in each of the missile launchers. Which will help highlight those little missile tubes. And then I can start just dropping a little bit on each of these metallic panels, which are supposed to be there to sort of represent hatches and airlocks and little the places where sort of radiators go and docking umbilicals and all those other little bits of stuff. The United Nations of Mankind are meant to be like a very neat faction, everything in its place, and so their faction really isn't one for greebles or their attitude is, but something that's hidden can't break as easily. And part of this is down to the fact that they're the only faction who's got proper, like, unrestricted faster than light travel, so all of their ships have to be sort of capable of doing like long Star Trek style voyages. So whereas it's okay if like a IP3 ship requires maintenance every sort of couple of weeks just to keep it in like tip-top shape, because I don't know, like a micrometeor got caught in a docking clamp. If you're stuck 20 light years from civilization, you need to know that everything is reliable enough to get you home. Actually, today I was just finishing up a script for a series of little lore explainer videos that talk a bit more about the universe and history of that universe of Solar Dominion, just to give people a little bit more of a insight into who are these people, why are they fighting, how did they get here. Alright, so that's all of the null... Oh, no it's not. We've just got these rear engines to go. Of course, one trick you could pull with these little rear engines is to take sort of successive layers of black, blue, red and purple and paint like a heat effect on them. Maybe not so much on these, maybe more on like the VBU ships. Good evening, Shaky Vox. So, the next step is going to be to apply the blue ink just over all of the blue parts. So here we've got to be quite careful because whilst most of the metallic parts were sort of well delineated from the white areas, the blue ones are often just painted on. But just loading the brush up a little bit, that's probably too much. And then just very carefully applying it into all of these recesses. Taking extra care not to let it onto the white areas. Now if you're thinking that this has darkened the blue up quite significantly, you'd be right. And that's why once this blue wash has dried, we're going to go back over it with our light blue paint, just to highlight it back up. But only touching the high areas. And then I'm just paying a little bit of extra care and attention to areas like the front section here where the wash didn't quite settle first time round, which sometimes happens if you've got if your initial coat of paint has gotten a glossy sheen to it, sometimes washes don't want to settle first time round. And so what you can do is you can hit it with a sort of matte varnish. Sure. So if you Google pictures of like motorcycle exhausts, there's, I can't remember the actual name of the effect, but as metals, especially like aluminium and steel, heat up, they change colour and they go through this sort of spectrum of colours. And so near the end of exhausts where hot exhausts are hitting it and warming it up unevenly, it heats from the edge. And so you just sort of paint on like successive layers of, well, successive coats of red, blue, purple, so that you end up like with this sort of heat rainbow at the end. And it's just this really little simple technique. And I've probably done a terrible job at explaining it. To be honest, when I get around to painting a VBU ship on stream, I will show it then, just because they've got so much more engine. In a moment, once I've finished applying the blue wash, I will grab one from just off camera, because it's sat here just off camera. The accidental overscaled prototype, because apparently I can't tell what site. Again, kind of going back to my stupid rant about sculpting stuff digitally is like painting through only through looking at your phone camera. It can sometimes be difficult to get a proper sense of scale when you're only working with a 3D model. So actually, because I just need to wash the brush out quickly. So here's the VBU ship I showed off last week, but you can see here at the back there's just so much more engine, and partly also because they've got much more of like an industrial aesthetic. I feel happier about painting these up with like the heat bloom effect on the engines. But given that this is a thank you. This was done half and half with masking and me doing it by hand just as like an experiment. And you can probably tell which half of the ship was done through which half. The one that doesn't look like complete crap is the one that I did with masking tape. But really I should have done it before assembling it. But this is supposed to be a frigate, so there's three main sizes of ship in Solar Dominion. Corvettes, frigates and destroyers. This, as I keep blathering on about on Twitter and Facebook, is a destroyer. It's the largest class of ship in the base game. This is supposed to be a frigate. If I sort of put them side by side, this is huge. So I've dropped it down by 20%, I think. So yes, I paint it yellow first, and then I paint it black, because otherwise, so you can do it the other way around. You just have to spray black, mask it, then spray white, and then spray the yellow on top. Or if you're not doing it with an airbrush, you can also do it with sponges. Yeah, maybe doing an alternate colour scheme for these where I actually do it like tiger stripes and actually sort of just lean whole hog into the unevenness and actually do like more of a biologically inspired one. That'd be nice. That'd be neat. For ages, I prevaricated around what I wanted the VBU aesthetic to look like, and there was a very brief period where I'd almost settled on super ostentatious 17th and 18th century gun engravings, which is like a super niche thing to base like color schemes on. But if you're ever in London, if you're ever in London, I can strongly recommend going to visit the Wallace collection if you are any kind of if you have any interest in early modern firearms or armor designs, because they have a huge if you mean the V&A, yeah, the V&A have a great collection of sort of ornate early modern firearms and armor, but the Wallace collection blows it out of the water, just in terms of the sheer variety of weird and wonderful little armor designs. Anyone who plays any sort of late medieval, early modern Victoria and Albert, the tiny museum dedicated to to her, I don't know. Is it a consort? If it's, yeah, I think it would be consort for person that Queen was having an affair with. To the GCHQ people watching, no, I'm not implying that the Queen had an affair. But yes, the V&A was one of... I was making a joke that she had an affair with a man called Elbert and then like opened a second museum. But yes, Victoria and Albert were married. But yeah, the V&A was my favourite museum when I lived in London. And it was a sad day when I it was a sad day when I moved up to when I cancelled my membership, just because it's not cheap. And whilst it was a great investment whilst I was living in London, and if you go more than once, or if you're under the age of 25 and you want to take someone else, it is cheaper to buy. It's cheaper to buy the +1 membership than it is to actually buy a ticket to get the second person in. Um, all right, so that's all of the well, that's the wash of the blue done. And so if I just hold it up to the camera and hope that the autofocus plays along. Come on. But hopefully you can see how the wash just sort of brings out the detail in that little emblem. I will try that again. I'll also try it whilst not also trying to hold a paintbrush and so the next thing we're going to do, I can figure out what I did with the brush. Is we're going to take some of this blue wash and we're going to very heavily dilute it, not with water but with airbrush thinner. Which has roughly the same effect as using just like normal medium, so like matte medium from Vallejo or Lamian medium from Games Workshop, except that because I airbrush, I have huge 200ml bottles of the stuff of airbrush thinner, and it's largely the same stuff, and it also helps it dry quicker. It's probably still not thin enough. What we're aiming for here is we want to put something in these recesses just to give it a little bit of a recess shade. And one of the tricks with painting white is if you shade white with black, it looks dirty and cold. But if you shade white with blue, because of how our eyes work, it tricks your eyes into thinking that it's looking at something a lot whiter than it is. And this was a trick I learned at a sugar museum, because it turns out sugar paper is called sugar paper, not because they make it with sugar or anything, but because they used to wrap sugar in blue sugar paper, and a combination of the texture and the colour tricked your eye into thinking the sugar was whiter than it was. And in fact, the whole reason that in the UK that sugar is No, and balls. I've actually overthinned that. But the whole reason in the UK that it's now sold in white packaging with blue lettering is that slowly companies started going, well, our sugar is white enough that we don't need to sell it in blue packaging. And so it's just a case of carefully trying to apply it mostly in the recesses, just because it'll give a little bit of definition, which is always one of the problems with painting white, because the other bit is when painting white you very rarely actually want to paint white. You usually want to paint like a very dark grey, sorry, very light grey, because what do you highlight white with? But by using this very dilute blue wash, something goes in the recesses whilst not overpowering the white, and then because of the aforementioned trick with the human eye, your brain goes, oh, that white is really bright. I mean, Shaky Box, if you want, if you would like to sell an even whiter white paint, be my guest. Although I had, so I was actually going to say the other trick that you use for white is you get pigment that fluoresces under UV light. In addition to stupid tricks with blue, because also like the laundry detergents that advertise themselves as being whiter than white are actually a very pale blue dye, which is why if you talk to any like decent tailor or suit shop or like shirt shop, they will tell you never ever ever wash an actual white shirt with those detergents because you will ruin them. Now quite often they're not a mild blue dye, but instead they're a dye of a pigment that fluoresces under UV light, which means that when you wear the shirt outside or under sort of daylight bulbs, you end up with a glowing shirt. And so I guess you could probably try and use similar pigments on white models to get a model that glows under white paint, well, glows under UV light. Of course, the downside is that the pigment in laundry, blah blah blah. I can't speak tonight. The pigment in laundry detergent doesn't have to last very long because hopefully you should be washing your clothes every couple. Well, you should be washing your clothes every couple of days, or at least not wearing them after you've worn them, and hopefully you aren't like storing your clothes just like in the window. Um, because like with glow in the dark paints, a lot of cheap glow in the dark paints don't last very long. Um, because the UV light that makes them glow also degrades them, which is why Stuart Semple's lit powders are so much more expensive than just buying cheap glow in the dark craft paints, but also as far as he's concerned, his lit paints will last longer than most other paints, whereas I mean, store your clothes where you like. I'm not your parents. At least I hope I'm not your parents. I kind of that would be like a weird temporal paradox thing. So, with the wash kind of slightly haphazardly applied, like I said at the start of this video, I've never claimed to be like a master painter. The next thing we're going to do is we're just going to take the light blue paint and we're going to repaint it over some of the high areas on the model. Just in an attempt to re-highlight. So for my day job, I work from home, which is most of the time great, but it means I've developed this habit of just, whenever I've got a song stuck in my head, I break into song, which is normally fine, except for when I'm either doing this on stream and I don't want to subject you all to my hot, terrible, terrible singing. But also occasionally I go and work from like a coffee shop or a co-working space, and people really don't like it if you just suddenly break into song. Apparently it's weird or distracting. But also I've been on a massive Steven Universe kick recently because you can now buy almost all of the episodes on YouTube. And that's got an awful lot of very good songs. But I had a meeting today and I'd turned my camera on and joined the video conference early, and so I was just sat there waiting, and I hadn't noticed that my co-worker had joined the chat, and I'd just been sat there singing for like a good minute. I won't spoil the ending. I think that the last couple of episodes are a little rushed, but I've got the film queued up, and I've heard very good things about it. Fewer songs, but equally as good. The Good Place has also started, I think its 4th series. And I'll admit I was a little apprehensive. About the 4th series of The Good Place. Wait, is that the first 3 series of Steven Universe are on Netflix, or the first 3 series of The Good Place? Yeah, so the 4th series has just started. The first episode went up last week. Once this stream's over, I will literally be going to watch the 2nd episode, which is now on Netflix. Ah, where's here? Um, just out of interest. Aha. See that I find that weird because like UK Netflix has got it, so I kind of assumed that US Netflix would, but then I imagine in the US they might have like because in the UK they advertise it as like a Netflix exclusive, but that can sometimes mean made by Netflix and other times mean Netflix have bought the rights to it in the UK and they're going to pretend it's theirs. So there I've re-highlighted all of the blue except for the emblems, which I'll just do now. I am terrible for yeah, well, licensing rights in general are just terrible. Um, I have been trying like massively to get the rights to Frank Sinatra's rendition of The Impossible Dream, because there's a Solar Dominion video I want to make, just like a short 60-second clip of a space fight that ends with one of these sort of moving into frame, Star Destroyer like, to fight some impossible battle. Closing on the rendition of To Dream an Impossible Dream. And obviously I don't want to just make it, upload it to YouTube, get YouTube just deleting it because I've used music I haven't got the rights to, and actually trying to get hold of the right person is just a nightmare, and trying to get anyone to tell me how much any of this actually costs, also a nightmare. So all of the blue has been painted. So you could probably just leave this here. You'd probably want to clean up a little bit of the whitewash. So actually, for just YouTube, for non-broadcast YouTube rights, I was seeing figures in, when I got quotes out of people, I was seeing figures in the low hundreds. And for sort of very limited broadcast rights, I was seeing figures in the range of pounds per 10,000 views. It was just actually trying to get someone to actually give me the official quote. But to be honest, it almost looks like it would be cheaper to buy rights to the lyrics. So licensing is weird. You can either buy like a general license, or you can buy like a license per number of copies sold, or you can buy like a license per tens or hundreds of thousands of views, or you can buy just a license to be able to put it on the internet or on the television, or you can buy time limited licenses. In fact, generally one of the reasons that like computer games disappear off the internet is because they will have bought like a license for 5 years. Or one of the worst ones was, there was an indie game that they bought a license for 1 million copies of the game. And as they were approaching it, they went back to the company they'd licensed the music from, and they were told that the price had gone up threefold. So they went, you know what, sod it. No, this isn't worth it anymore. And so just took the game off sale. Welcome to the hellish world of licensing, and why you should never complain about stuff disappearing off Netflix, except complain to everyone all the time, because it's the only way anything will ever get better. So, away from moaning about music rights, back to the model. You could call it quits here. This is a perfectly usable model. You probably want to clean up the whites a little bit, just because the wash has left a bit, because I wasn't too great at applying the wash, it's left it just a little bit patchy, and I might do that a little bit off camera. But in about 3 hours from having the model in pieces to having the model in a perfectly playable state, I don't think that's bad, and especially considering some of that was me blathering on screen and doing stuff slowly for the camera. Um, and especially if you're a more accomplished painter than I am. And that's not to say that there isn't more stuff you can do. If you pay close attention to the image in the bottom right, um, there are a couple of details. Like on the 3D model, I put a tiny little bit of hazard striping on and around the escape pods, which you could do just by drawing a little yellow line and then taking something like a micron pen and just drawing the hatching in. Um, and if you were feeling particularly brave, you could even try painting the ship's name onto the neck. I am hoping to produce some decal sheets which will include details like that. But again, one of the things I'm learning quite rapidly whilst making this game is just how expensive everything is to get made. Although on the upside from, if you're in any of the communities I've talked about this in, the cost of making just like individual cards was way more than I was expecting. But I have since found a solution, and so hopefully in the very near future I'll be talking a bit more about that. But cards are back on the menu. But yeah, so running up on 90 minutes, like, if anyone's got any questions, I can answer them. To be fair, it's less just random card pricing woes and more the price of getting a very small number of cards made. Because the more cards you make, the lower the price per card goes. And so if I was making a game that had like 100 cards per player, or per copy, then that wouldn't be so much of a problem. But it was the fact that each game only needs like 10 cards in 5 designs. And also it helps that I was having a conversation with someone, and I'm going to test a system that means that different variants of the ship can share a card, which will be made slightly easier by the fact that now I'm actually going a little bit larger from Tarot to A6. And this was also partly inspired. I've started playing a game called Cruel Seas, which is made by Warlord Games, which is another of the big war games manufacturers here in Nottingham. And actually, I can showing my. So A6 isn't actually that much larger than Tarot, but so I've been painting up the Cruel Seas spaceships. No, not spaceships. These aren't spaceships. There were no spaceships in World War II. At least that's what they want you to think. But this game has A6 cards in it. Yeah, A6 is about the same size step up from Tarot as Tarot is from like standard poker card. But yeah, the Cruel Seas models themselves are quite nice. They're a bit simple, but because they're war games models rather than like proper collector's models. Like this is another one. These are the Italian Navy. Just sort of that. Partly, who doesn't want to go to war in a bunch of floating hairdressers? And also the story of the Italian military in World War II is one of sort of continual mismanagement and woe. And the fact that they swapped sides halfway through the war. But yeah, thank you very much for everyone who's joined in. Like I said, there'll probably be no stream next week, just so I can get some other stuff done. But I will put up a poll at some point shortly for what I will build and paint on the next stream. 50-50, because Facebook only lets you put two things in a poll with a picture. Either the IP3 frigate or a space station. So great, thank you very much everyone for tuning in, and see you in 2 weeks.